This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And Dave on the board. We're not quite there yet. The date for our code is the 15th of February, and it's 2015. Today, I'd like to talk about the barrier reef. We had Don Davis in talking about it a little bit a couple of times ago, but in the process of working with him, I ran into a book that I had on hand, which was by a woman named Joan Colebrook, and I thought it would be interesting to speak to that book and sort of remind you how important it is for people to leave some of their record. Joan has long since passed on, but her record of growing up as the fourth daughter of a family of 5 daughters and 1 boy in northern Queensland, where there was tropical rainforest. But that'll be the tenure of today's talk. First, I'm going to say something about salvage. I keep running into problems of my own making, but this week I went round to the art gallery, which is run by the university, just sort of backs onto WEFT, and the lights had been changed. The fixtures for the lights had been changed, and they'd been put into the garbage. They were basically steel. There might have been a few elements of plastic, but when you salvage, you're allowed to have a little bit of other material. You're only going to get baling, what they call baling finance for it. But so it's very simple, but the main thing is to keep the steel out of the landfill. So I went over to the gallery. I'm kind of interested in the gallery. It started out as a gallery in Chicago for staff, art department staff and students to present their artwork to the public, to have some public reaction. But it was fairly expensive and wasn't attracting that much attention, so they brought that studio back to Champaign, and it's around the corner and has interesting displays. I went round, and sure enough, they had changed the light bulbs, probably physical plants, since it's a U of I, University of Illinois event. And so I have a little box of metal that I'll take around and eventually beg that they recycle this. That means that you have to have a physical plant that is also attuned to recycling. It's not always the case. It's very easy for people who are working in physical plant situations to regard an item or that is not exactly creditable salvage. So it goes out in the dumpster. I also had a visit from the police department because I'd been at the dumpster around the corner at night when some material was being dropped by other people, and the material in question was a 3-gallon plastic container that provides oil, and it was in a cardboard container. And so I had said, no, please don't put that in the garbage. And I indicated that the cardboard could be quite easily taken out and put in the next door bin, and the plastic could be preserved and recycled. So, but I was probably a little brash in that maneuver. So we had quite a nice conversation with the policeman, and he understands what we do and why. And I also had an interesting conversation with the owner of the store from which the plastic came in the first place. And I think that's, well, it's very healthy, because I like to be upfront with what I do, and a little bit of discussion is very helpful. The next door building to us, where Rubel was, where Captain Rats and the Blind River and Pogo, and he's moved out and gone to Tennessee as a teacher at the university and teaching the subject of recording. And the people who are remodeling the area, it will still be a sound studio. So, but it's been kind of gutted, and I was watching empty boxes go into to the gondola, which is quite a big garbage can, and I managed to preserve a wheelchair from there. Wheelchairs are often very good for people who are doing film work. And Mark used to do some film work. He used to come into my office, which is kind of a rat trap in a way, and we did a whole film there. I was Mr. Reaper, and this was a 30-minute video to go to Hollywood. So I know that Mark was interested in movies, and wheelchairs have very big wheels, and so you can put a camera in a wheelchair and move it along, and you reduce the bumps in the camera. So I harvested that, but shortly there was all sorts of plaster and other things in there. And I think basically the construction people do salvage the steel that they come across as they're doing this sort of work. But we have some discussions because we have a fire door between us, and that fire door allows us to escape if necessary, or if there's a fire in a downstairs situation and people cannot go down the stairs in the building, then it may be that they have to come out through a fire door to our end of the world and out our front door. It is interesting that the fire door that I was a little worried about, because I thought it might be taken out, was very successful in its day. When the building was owned by the Grubb Printing Company, it was a dark room, and the door, the fire door, which was open, fire occurred in the dark room, and the fire door has a fixture that if it melts, the door rolls closed. It has a heavy weight on it. And the door did that and blocked off the oxygen to the fire, so there was lots of water due to the fire department putting out the fire, but it had already been stopped by the fire door. So fire doors can be helpful. A little comment about dog do. We have sewers mainly to see that human feces get treated in a treatment plant. It's often with bacteria and sometimes with chemicals, including chemicals that like chlorine that mildly used, and that sewage is broken down. Well, animals also have a problem. Some of them have diarrhea and disease. Some of them quite innocently pooping, and often is a temptation to throw the poop into the dumpster. So that goes to the landfill, and it's not treated in the same way. So if you're kind and you're generous enough to pick up your poop in the first place, then one more generosity is to take that poop to your sewer and put it in the toilet rather than in the dumpster. And if you have a veterinarian that's doing looking at this sort of situation, they are fairly adamant about the picking up, and also I think about the treatment of that dog do. So that's my small amount on salvage at the moment. Let's go to Joan Colebrook. She was born in 1912 and passed in 1991. She was 80. But she grew up with a family that was in the hinterlands of northern Australia. And when we spoke about Australia, we were talking about the Barrier Reef, but there are a couple of features that are worth remembering. One is that the east side of Australia is in effect Gondwana land, that big plate, that tectonic that moves around the Pacific and was connected to India, and that's end of the continental shift. Left one plate moving over the other, and so right down the east coast of Australia from north to south and even a little bit around the corner in Victoria is a mountain chain that is an uplift with one plate slowly moving over another. It's geologically, it makes cracks and faults that allow chemicals to coalesce so that you find seams of gold and tin and copper, and some of the early expansion of Australia was to get into mining. So Joan Colebrook was the daughter of someone who had been educated. The father of the system was educated at Dookie, an agricultural college in Victoria, had gone north, as many others did, and he was in Tenterfield, which is in New South Wales, just lower than Queensland, and a little bit further away from the tropics. But my father was a school teacher in that area. He was a school teacher in a small copper mining town, which is on this sort of ridge. And my brother was actually born there. So this book deals with a lot of things that are very familiar to me as I grew up on that ridge. my father eventually moved from the copper mining area to the coastal part of the plain in front of the Great Divide. But many of the things happened were the same. Up the hill, when you have a Great Divide, you have tropical rainforest growing on basaltic soils that were part of the movement of tectonics. You allow some molten material to come up through the mountain. So right along this ridge, there are outliers of basaltic soil, and then there's a term for this. It's called edaphic. The rainforests grow on that particular edaphic soil, which is means that the forest is tropical, but all around it is a more wizen type of eucalyptus forest on dry ground where it didn't benefit from rich volcanic soil around it. Those areas erode and provide alluvium on coastal creeks and rivers that are also a little more rich than the native soil on the hills and valleys around. So it's spread around a little, but basically it's an outlier. So northern New South Wales and Queensland are nearer to the equator. So you have these mountains, and these mountains collect a lot of rain. They get monsoonal rains in January and February. You also, this is the only barrier to rain moving across from the Indian Ocean. If you come 3,000 miles across Australia, it's very dry. But if the clouds are loaded with moisture, they then raise up, and that cools them and they drop rain. So you get rain from two directions. In my little town or village of Thora, I woke up on my veranda bed every morning to a 2,000-foot mountain across the way. There was a river that moved down in front of this mountain range and headed off to the coast. Usually a very fairly fast-moving river because it was falling from 2,000 feet down onto the alluvial plains and then out to sea. So there were parallels. When you move north, the gentleman that was Joan's father was well educated. He joined up with a group of other well educated people. Her mother was also well educated, and I'm not quite sure how she got there, but I think she was derivative of mining people too. These were miners who looked for gold with a pan, but they also were looking for tin, and when they found a seam, they would put in a smelter, and this was a lucrative business as long as the seam remained available. So there were lots of workers, and the leaders were included Joan's father. When it became less lucrative to be mining, Father moved north to Cairns, and there went up over the hump. They called it the bump, not the hump. But the bump was this Great Divide, and the tropical rainforest was really large, and So these were settlers who often had a one-room shack. I grew up with some of those, often with slabs for the walls and slabs for the floor. Sometimes there was no floor but a dirt floor. You found some clay and had a dirt floor. Often the building had a galley, which was an area near the house that more or less is where you boiled your water, cooked your potatoes or whatever, and you had a garden. Gradually you grew up from that to a bigger house that probably had a lounge room and some bedrooms. Still pretty meager. You invariably had a veranda so that you didn't have air conditioning. So in the summer it's not unusual to have 90s and 100-degree temperatures. So it's handy to have a veranda. Sometimes you put your house up on stilts. They're like foundations made out of trees that are about the size of a telephone pole, and your house is settled on those trees. Those foundations, and that allows air to move under the house and cool. Sometimes where there's a lowland, those stilts are very high because at times when there is a flood, there is a need to be higher than the water level. This is an area of rainfall where I grew up. The McGrath's Hump had an 80-inch rainfall, which is quite a lot. And it comes sometimes suddenly and unexpectedly. So the road that came from the coast through Bellingen, through Thora, and up the hill to Dorrigo often was closed when there was a flood time. And you had to put up people. My father was a school teacher, so he had a weather shed, and people would live in the weather shed for a few days until the river went down. And some of those people taught us how to find eels and catfish in the muddy water. Those two creatures can handle muddy water, so we would also be taught how to fillet those. They're very bony creatures, so you need to fillet them, and that is helpful. After a while, my family got so good at doing this that they would leave a catfish or an eel, both of which have a sort of slimy body, not so much scales, but so not everyone enjoys a catfish or an eel, but we enjoyed those, and others would go for perch or more sophisticated fish. So there were floods. There were also droughts. My father had an old whippet, a 1928 whippet, and it had running boards on it. And in a drought time when our tanks were empty, you have to know that the house that we lived in had 4,000-gallon tanks, and when it rained, the rain ran off the roof into the tank, and any dust that was with it rolled into the tank too. So every once in a while you had to have someone with a siphon to siphon out the dirt from your tank. And you had to have a screen over the opening to the tank because the frogs and the rats and a few other things would get into the tank, especially when it was dry season. And it wasn't very healthy to eat those creatures. We had an outdoor toilet. We had no electricity. And this is exactly what Joan had. It was interesting that there were 5 girls and one boy, and that meant that these were people who had come from the empire. The sun never set on the British Empire. So there was a relation to an empire. And so a few of these rules of the game, even in the bush, were oriented to a tradition of Britain. My mother was British. She grew up in the inner London as a Cockney, had a speech pattern of a bird. It's called a glottal stop. My mother never lost her glottal stop. But she would do things that were like the climate. My father would say, "Mother, you don't really need to put all the laundry out to air. It's dry enough here that it airs almost automatically." But Mother would always put her clothing out to air, and sheets and pillow slips and things got ironed. So there was a sort of formality there. And the family that was Jones' family had that similar background, an orientation to what was the national thing to do and what was the thing you had to do because you were in a very, very primitive situation. So there were girls that Grandma would have come to the goldfields side saddle, but the granddaughters were probably not at any time doing a side saddle. They were riding horses in a more practical manner. They had freedom to do a lot of things that their counterpart women in a city situation would not have been able to do. They were almost essential to do survival type things that normally you'd expect men to do, but in this case they had father, and father was fairly strong on politics, so he sometimes was not there. He was a member of the country club, which is the country party, which was the very conservative side of Australian politics and still is. But there was a royal opposition was the Labor Party, which was putting in railroads and making roads and taking down forests and running timber mills and building boats and what have you. So in his era, he campaigned but didn't win because Labor was stronger. That sort of backs and forths across Australia yet. And you hear it in the last few days. The Prime Minister of Australia, in a very conservative coalition, has survived, but he doesn't believe in climate change. And he has been giving a lot of people a lot of disappointment. But he's survived. He may not survive another election. And in Queensland at the moment is possibly tending towards Labor. And so there's politics in there. The young male of this family of 6 children was the second last, so he was very small. So the elder daughter, Hazel, was helped to bring up the family. I did a lot of the chores and a lot of the things that men would normally be involved with. Mother was well educated, and she would bring these people up as strictly as it was practical, but with that background of strength of where you grew up. I'm looking at my notes now.
Well, while you're looking at them, something we often don't do is mention at the half point of the show what people are tuned into in case they weren't here at the beginning. So this is WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM, and this is the Prairie Monk. Typically, you'll hear things about the environment and about our area, but we're taking a break and we're talking about where Dave comes from, and he's got a book by a woman who seems to have grown up in much the same sorts of situation. Also did not have electricity in Australia and
Yes.
and so on. So you want to mention the book again and the
Yes.
author?
House of Trees is the book, and it's on Amazon. I just looked it up a while ago. The front page has the name of Bailey in it, and a phone number. I didn't call her up, but her mother was local, and her mother and father had a house on Michigan Avenue, and father was an architect, so this was a one-owner house, and father passed, but mother, up to the age of 100, was still playing the piano locally at various places, and so Mike Bailey was her daughter, and we would encounter every once in a while, and she contributed to our rail trails and greenways efforts. And she's probably older now, but I thought to call the phone number that's in the book. But she was very aware that I was Australian and liked this book, I think. I've had it for some time. So there we are on the Great Divide, but nearby in the ocean is a Great Barrier Reef, and that runs all the way from New Guinea down to almost north of Brisbane, probably Rockhampton. It is one of the world's greatest barrier reefs. It is biodiverse, and we heard a little bit of that from Don Davis, who was here as a guest just 2 weeks ago. The father and the daughter, Joan, often had some of the same interests, and the family would go out to the Barrier Reef and stay there, and they were kind of appalled by the fact that the reef had been discovered by people from the north, and they would have things like clamshells that were the size of a man, sometimes up to 12 feet tall. And you could take a big stick and put it in the open jaws of a clamshell, and the stick would be broken if you disturbed it, and the animal realized that you were there was something there that they might be food that they could close in on. That internal material was proteinaceous. It was food. So people came down from the north and took that. So these people, Joan and her father and her other siblings, would be observing creatures that you would never see again. These creatures would be rapidly exterminated, and that has gone on for years and years. I can remember going back to my parallel situation. Just down the road from us, there was a fishing area where there were a lot of lobsters, and the lobster pots were often salvaged by Japanese boats that came down to the coast. I can remember when there was even some shooting going on because of this, and that was well before there was a World War II. So that pilfering of the Barrier Reef has been going on, but in the book they were recording that they were going to be the last ones to see some of those big creatures. You have to imagine that they They're big enough that at low tide, if you happen to put your foot into a clamshell, you were going to be there, and as the tide rose, you were going to get drowned because you weren't going to get out of it. So this was a dangerous area. You went into a rainforest, and the Aboriginals were there. And the Aboriginals tended to be communistic in the fact of sharing their things until they began to realize that they were also being screwed. Their habitat was being taken out. They didn't exactly understand why it was being taken out. They had their little gunyahs of houses with bark roofs leaned up against a tree, or they had their corroborees. They were sometimes abused by people who wanted to track other people, other Aboriginals. Aboriginal trackers are very aware of their environment, and they can follow people, but sometimes they were forced to follow their own people because they were in survival. Their territory, their food, their livelihood was taken away by the removal of rainforests. The rainforests were dangerous. When World War II came along, they wanted the biggest and the best trees for boats building and a whole bunch of things. So the son of this family eventually died doing that sort of work because there's a tendency to line your logs up. And going back to my experience, just down the road some, you made a platform which was made of logs, and you rolled your logs up on that platform so that they were about 4 feet off the ground, and then you had a timber jinker which you parked adjacent to the pile of logs, and put them on the timber jinker. These logs were probably 3 feet across and long, so you had to have chains and equipment to roll them onto a jinker. You may have to extend the jinker's back wheels so that it would take a longer log. You couldn't take them too long because the roads were kind of primitive, and if you went around a bend, you mightn't get the vehicle around the bend because it was too hairpinned. So those logs were stacked up, and when you got people doing the job quickly, they didn't always put the proper chocks under the logs, so that when you have a pile of logs like that, they're dangerous. And the son of this family was in that situation where the logs started to move, and he got caught in a liana vine. A liana is a sort of like a rope, and it climbs through the forest, and it's very hard to deal with. So his foot got tripped in a liana vine, and he couldn't get away, and the logs rolled over him, and he lost his life doing that. Other people lost their lives in different ways. The prospectors were there, and the prospectors would want to go north, and sometimes they'd go north as far as New Guinea, and in the process they might encounter Aboriginals that would spear them, and sometimes eat them. So you have to know that this is in my grandfather's time. We were still dealing with that, and there was a logic to it because in some places there were not a lot of protein, and so this seemed to be a logical thing to do. And sometimes the leaders of the prospectors would stay back in a boat that was parked in the river, and they would be subject to spears being thrown at them and things like that, and they would lose their lives. So this was dangerous, and people don't mind danger. They know it, and they're going to challenge it. There were also missionaries. You have to know that these people weren't necessarily going to church every Sunday. They have grown up with lots of freedom, and but the Bush brothers were there. The Church of England in Australia, and like most other British colonies, was the state church, and it had a lot of power. There are two branches of the state church. One is rather evangelical. The other is rather conservative. The Bush brothers are the conservative people. I grew up with people even at university level. The Bush brothers were much more Catholic in style. You accepted temptation. I can remember going to an event where the Bush brother with buckle shoes and frock coat and dignity and leadership was teaching young people how to handle liquor. He was had brandy that you had bouquet de bouche, and you smelled it and you enjoyed it, and that was a temptation that you could deal with. The Bush brothers were much more attuned to being friends with the priests at the Catholic Church, and we knew that. The missionary people, that moved into the north were basically Bush brothers. The evangelical style of the Anglican Church is more confined to the cities, and that still exists. And that goes along with schools. So these people had to go to school. One way my cousin's doing this in Central Australia was to have a radio program. It's called Blackfriars, and you may have had a governess, and that was like a nanny, and the governess would work with the children and help the mother and the family, but she would also help with the education. Then there was a high school, so you had to go to boarding school, and that's where the Church of England and the Bush brothers had a handle on things. Fairly formal, and prayers that were not necessarily spontaneous, but very well organized, and people knew that. So that created a certain type of person, a very responsible person, but it was rather different from the people in the goldfields that were doing a lot of the work. The Mormon church was there, and other churches were at some of those places where there was theft and drinking and prostitution, and so there was a spirit of reform. So Joan went to high school and then went to the university. A fairly unusual thing for someone in that situation to do, unless you had enough money to do it. She stayed at the women's college. She took a ferry across the Brisbane River to the university. She observed an interesting fellow who used to always have a book of some description under his wing, and there was the ferry would sort itself out as to the plebeians and the thinkers, or it's not unusual in Australia. It's not unusual to go to a dance hall and find all the women on one end of the dance hall and all the men on the other end of the dance hall. And when you went to dance, you took off and tried to gather up your friend that was in amongst the women. So university still did that, some of that sort of thing. And so when she would go across the river with the ferry, she would observe this guy. And after a long, long time, she got introduced to him and then fell in love with him. And he had been a person in a similar situation, but he had to go and be a banker because the family didn't have enough money for him to do what he would have wanted to do, whether it was farming or whatever. So he'd become a banker, but he'd retained his education, and he was independently educated. And she found him to be a soul, a like soul. Well, unfortunately, he was married and they separated. But then she met an American diplomat, and she married him and came to the U.S. and also ended up in other diplomatic situations like London, and that expanded her education. She became a journalist and began writing novels and books. And so when you go to see a house of trees, you'll find that there are other books. She did a lot of work with disadvantaged children and wrote a book about that, which was fairly well established. But let me look at my notes a little bit here. I think I've covered quite a few things. Oh, one of the things they had was tornadoes. And these were not called tornadoes, cyclones they called them. And they would come in associated with the monsoons. And very quickly you could have a river running into torrent. My father, when he was school teacher at a one-teacher school with 7 grades in the same room, if once it started to rain and you were watching the clouds, because if you saw them with a certain amount of black around them, you knew that was going to be a rainstorm. So he would have to let the people from Little North Arm go because they had a log across the creek, but they also had a flat-bottom boat there. If the log was covered, then you would be able to get the boat out of the reeds and boat across to the other side with a pole, probably. This sort of way of getting to your house under the mountains was an anathema to my mother. She could never walk across that plank. But if you were used to it, you could run across that plank. Often it was, you had a broad axe and made a flat surface on the plank. Sometimes there was a big rock in the middle, so you could have one tree to the rock and another tree to the other bank. But Father would always have to let those people go early because they would be in jeopardy. We had a blacksmith, and I think I said something about the blacksmith last week, but Edgar was that blacksmith, and he was very deaf because he was always using an anvil to shoe horses, and he had a big bellows, which was about 10 feet long, and he had a arm that he could raise and lower the bellows, so he could have very soft heat or he could have heavy heat. And there was charcoal, and everything was black, and you could put in a tire, a steel tire, to go on a sulky wheel, and you could expand it. as the heat got into the sulky wheel, you could expand it and drop it on the wooden framework of the wheel, and then as the steel cooled, it would tighten onto the framework of the wheel. And there were bearings. You had to replace the bearings. Might be a copper bearing. Sometimes you could drive along behind someone who had a horse and cart, and you could see the wheels wobble, and you had to know that it was time for them to go to the Edgar blacksmith. So there were services. There were roads. The roads were dirt roads. Often, when you're in a basaltic situation, you have kaolin clay, and it's rich, but it's often very red. There's a lot of iron there, and so the roads were often red. Our roads were not so redwood because we were on the coastal part of the Great Divide, and we were only privileged to have the leachates, or the eroded material that has come from the basaltic soils on the hills. Eventually, the railroads came, and the railroads used a lot of the wood because it takes 2,000 ties a mile to make a railroad. And gradually the railroad would come. Did it come through your town? Did it come through other places? It had to be surveyed. The landowners who had settled and paid the government for settlement of plots of land, the same thing happened here. You didn't preserve the land for the Aboriginals, you took it over. And Joan's father probably supplied the land for a one-teacher school. You would have an annual picnic. We had annual picnics that were a get-together for all those people that you didn't see because they were far enough away that you didn't see them. You had flat races and the like. No one wore any shoes. The rainfall was such that you got mud. If it was dry, you had bull dust. So you could take your feet and put it into the bull dust and create a cloud of dust in a dry season. In the wet season, that same bull dust was mud. And if you had cattle to bring in to milk them and the like, you had yards that were very muddy, and there was no point in running around with blucher boots, which are kind of handy, but they are not as free to allow you to move as to having bare feet. Your feet grew gristle on the bottom, so that you could stand on a piece of steel or wood or gravel, and you would survive. You could use your toes to pick up things. You could pick up a stone. If I needed to encourage a cow to move along, I would take my foot and grab a stone and put it into my hand and throw the stone at the cow to encourage her to move along, because sometimes the leader of the push brought the other cows along too. Sometimes you didn't throw a stone, you actually had an imaginary stone, and that would encourage movement. But we were very kind to our cows. You usually knew them as friends and pets, and you could scratch behind their horns or under their chin, or and you would milk them without having to have them in an enclosed bale or something that would contain them. Yeah. You would have chickens. you'd have pigs. The milk, you were far enough away from places like Cairns that you couldn't send milk to town. You had a butter factory, and Joan's father was on the butter factory board, and probably had a lot to do with generating butter. You would have these huge steam engines that ran, or sometimes there were internal combustion engines, but they would run huge wheels that then ran compressors and allowed you to have refrigeration. But butter is basically a fat, and without refrigeration it could go back to the old country. It would take six weeks to get to England, and you would have problems on the way. Small boats would ride the waves. Early on, they were windjammers, and you had to work with sailors who could quickly remove a sail so that the ship would not be torn apart. Then later, you got to have steam boats, and then internal combustion engines too. So we're coming to the end of our little discussion of Northern Australia, and it's not too unlike from what I grew up with. And so this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And you want to tell people one more time what that book is and the author's name?
Yes. A House of Trees by Joan Colebrook, Colebrook.